Hello, welcome. Dr. Sushma Singh this side. Today in Unit 13, Agrarian Classes and Categories, we are going to start our lecture with topic the classical notion of undifferentiated peasant society. Anthropologists developed the classical notion of peasant society during the post-war period, that is after 1945. This notion was largely derived from the Western experience. Peasant societies were seen to have emerged after disintegration of the tribal form of society, social and economic life, when human beings began to earn their living by cultivating land. They also started living in a small settlements. The typical peasant societies were seen to be pre-industrial in nature. As the economies developed with the onset of the Industrial Revolution, the traditional peasant way of life gradually began to change, giving way to the modern urban lifestyle. Peasantry in this anthropological perspective was essentially an undifferentiated social formation. In terms of their social and economic organization, peasants were all similar to each other. They cultivated their own plots of land with the labor of their families and produced primarily for the consumption of their own families. In other words, there were no significant class differences within the peasantry, while internally the peasantry was more or less homogeneous. Peasant society were invariably dominated by from outside by the urban elite. Unlike the primitive or tribal communities, peasant societies produced surplus. That is, they produced more than what there was enough for the subsistence requirement of their families and for the consumption of those who depended directly on them. This surplus was, however, transferred to the dominant ruling elite, who invariably lived in the city, mostly in the form of land tax or the land revenue. In cultural and social terms, peasants were seen to be fundamentally different from the modern entrepreneurs. Their attitude toward the work and their relationship to the land was very different from that of the profit-seeking entrepreneurs of the modern industrial societies. Robert Redcliffe, who pioneered anthropological research on peasantry, argued that the peasantry was an universal human type. They were attached to the land through the bonds of the settlements and emotions. Agriculture to them was livelihood and a way of life, not a business for profit. Writing in a similar mode during the early 20th century, a Russian economist A.N. Chainov had also argued that the governing logic of the peasant economies was different from the modern industrial economies. Unlike the industrial societies where economic process was governed by the principle of profit maximization and laws of capital, the logic of peasant economy was subsistence oriented. The variation in the farm size and productivity of land in the Russian countryside were not guided by the quest for profit or class difference, but by the demographic factors. As the size of the household grew, the requirement for the food and availability of the labor power with the household also grew. This directly resulted in an enlargement of the amount of land and household cultivated. However, as the size of the household declined over time, with newer members settling up their own independent household, the holding size also declined. Following this classical discussion, Theodore Shanin developed an ideal type of the peasant society. He defined a peasant as a small agricultural producers who, with the help of simple equipment and the labor of their families, produced mostly for their own consumption, direct or indirect, and for the fulfillment of obligations to holders of political and economic power. He further identified four independent facets of peasant societies. The first, peasant family worked as a basic multidimensional unit of social organization. The family farm operated as a major unit of peasant property, production, consumption, welfare, and social production, identity, prestige, sociability, and welfare. The individual tended to submit to a formalized family role behavior and patriarchal authority. Second, the large husbandry worked as the main means of livelihood. Peasant farming was characterized by traditionally defined social organization and a low level of technology. Third, peasant societies followed specific cultural patterns linked to the way of life of a small rural community. Peasant culture often conformed to the traditional norms of behavior and was characterized by face to face relations. And fourth, peasantry was almost always dominated by outsiders. The peasants were invariably kept at arm's length from the source of the power. Shanin argued that this their political subjection was also interlinked with their cultural subordination and economic exploitation. In this kind of framework, though peasants were seen as being dominated by outsiders, they were not viewed as being different from each other, particularly in terms of their class status. In other words, in this classical notion of the peasantry society, there were no internal class differences within the peasantry. The core unit of social organization was the peasant household. However, this conception of peasant society emerged from the specific experience of the European societies. The historical literature on different regions of the world tends to show that agrarian societies were not as homogeneous as they are made out to be in such formulations. Agrarian societies were also internally differentiated in different strata. In India, for example, the rural society were divided between different caste groups, and only some groups had the right to cultivate land while others were obliged to provide services to the cultivators. Similarly, parts of the Europe had serfdom, where the overlords dominated the peasantry. Such societies were also known as feudal societies. Here we want to close this lecture. Thanks for listening.